Hi everyone, it's John. It's Tuesday afternoon, so I have another book review to share with you guys. This week I have an interesting book of history I want to talk about by a historian who, in my estimation, just has to be one of the most wonderful historians of her region and her time period that she studies, not that she wrote in, that I've ever come across. And I really wanted to share her name with you because I don't think I've ever reviewed a book by her in all of my 200 odd book reviews that I've posted on this channel. And her name is Anne Applebaum. And she wrote this wonderful book, as I'll talk about in the body of my review. This is actually the second book I've read by Anne Applebaum. This is Iron Curtain, The Crushing of Eastern Europe, 1944 to 1956. And as you can see right here, that is another book I was particularly interested in when I read it. I'd like to open, before I say anything formally about the book or the author, by a quote, with a quote by Boris Pasternak, taken from his perhaps the only thing we ever read by Pasternak anymore, which would be Dr. Zhivago. And so it was necessary to teach people not to think and make judgments, to compel them to see the non-existent and to argue the opposite of what was obvious to everyone. So I first encountered Anne Applebaum's book, Gulag: A History, in my university bookstore around 2003 or 2004, as it was a new release. I had my suspicions about how such a thick brick of a book could engage popular readers, but spring break was coming up and I needed something to look really intimidating so people could ask me about it while I was out on the beach and everyone else was insisting on getting into the water and having fun. I was reading about Siberian gulags. It also happened to be my first exposure to Lavrentiy Beria, perhaps Stalin's most sadistic and pathological henchman. Beria was also the head of Stalin's NKVD, his secret police. And Beria seems to be a figure that's popping up a lot in some of my just private reading that I do. So sort of like a haunting refrain throughout some of my reading. Now that I've read Iron Curtain, which was every bit as good as the Gulag history, I want to read her recent full-length book, which came out within the past few years, I think, called Red Famine, Stalin's War on Ukraine, 1921 to 1933, which is her mortifying history of the Holodomor. Holodomor. I always transpose the D and the M. The Holodomor, which is sort of like the word Holocaust, almost uniquely defines what happened under Hitler's regime in Germany during World War II to the Jews and a small group of other populations and identities that he wanted to eliminate. The Holodomor signifies Stalin's attempt to basically starve many millions of Ukrainians, systematically starve them. This was not some sort of agricultural failure. It was a planned mass starvation of millions of Ukrainians. And after reading that book, I have, unless it goes less wonderfully than the last two have, I have every confidence that this trilogy will rank Anne Applebaum as one of the finest popular historians of the Soviet Union and Eastern European history, currently writing in English, that I know of. It will come as no surprise, given Applebaum's subject matter and the time period that she's writing about, that her books are both terrifying, but they're also simultaneous testaments to the power of human resilience. After the end of World War II, just to give you a bit of background, the already uneasy US-Soviet relationship grew even more awkward as the legacy of Stalinist policies slowly began to spread out of the Soviet Union and creep into the countries of what we now call the Soviet bloc in Eastern Europe. Seemingly one after another of these countries in Eastern Europe fell prey to Stalin's geopolitical influence, as he and his ideological confreres established a series of tin pot autocrats who were more than willing to make the Faustian bargain of paying obeisance to Moscow, often for their own middling political gain. Bulgaria fell in 1946, Romania fell in 1947, Czechoslovakia fell in 1948. 1949 saw both the falling of East Germany and Hungary to communist rule. This series of political dissolutions eventually led the way for hardliners, autocrats, authoritarians, totalitarians. You choose the label of your choice, but some pretty horrible people, the likes of Todor Zhukov, Nicolae Ceausescu, Erich Honecker, and the famous communist leader of Hungary by the name of Matyas Rákosi. In The Iron Curtain, Applebaum looks at the various ways in which civil, political, and community life were destroyed or completely upended by the arrival of the communist regime, and especially the ways in which Stalin used his covert operations to export the constant invigilation of totalitarianism into these countries. This book is a primer for understanding the institutions and methods by which Stalin did this and exerted his power doing this. It is a story of unrelenting oppression, bald-faced propaganda, and the destruction of the way of life for tens of millions of Europeans. Not long after the war ended, the Soviets established training camps throughout Eastern Europe in order to instruct the officialdom of these countries in how to control their populations through propaganda, reconnaissance, and other authoritarian measures. Then they took control of the media, and in the immediate years after World War II, television wasn't quite a thing yet, so the most popular and influential form of media was still the radio. And it used the radio, as well as other organs of the media, like the newspaper, magazines, etc., in order to mobilize Communist Party messages. Other institutions, like youth groups, churches, schools, the party used to harass and persecute those who had misgivings about it, and to utterly destroy those who had actively worked against it. It is arranged almost topically by chapter, which makes it really easy to read. Each chapter discusses some aspect of communist rule under the newly liberated country. So there are titles like Ethnic Cleansing, Youth, Radio, which I just covered, Politics, and Economics. And these short, very demonstrative titles make this sort of not only engaging history, that's because of the way she writes, but the titles also make it very valuable, very easy to reference, and what would probably be a very good source book for future students and researchers and scholars. Applebaum goes out of her way, more than anyone else I've ever read, with the possible exception of the political writer and thinker Hannah Arendt, to emphasize that these regimes wanted more than to just refashion political and economic life in these countries. However, if that was all that they wanted to do, the huge apparatuses of propaganda and other state machinery wouldn't have been so vitally important. What they wanted to do, rather, was to fundamentally reshape human nature in the party's image. When people ask, why did communism fail? The trite and wrote answers of, well, government is just too inefficient to provide for its people on its own, or something about the failure of public ownership of the means of production. Answers like this can only really begin to scratch the surface of the real problem. The reason why communism failed, at least the unique brand of totalitarian, Leninist, Stalinist communism that we're speaking of at this particular time and place, is because it did not recognize certain rudimentary facts of human nature. While it's nowhere near the focus of Applebaum's book, what I mentioned above about the resilience of people is not just a saccharine sentiment. At the end of the book, there's a trio of chapters titled Reluctant Collaborators, Passive Opponents, and Revolutions, which detail the ways in which people grew more and more courageous in the ways that they undermined and subverted the regime for the purposes of returning to something like the status quo, something like the way things used to be before the communists arrived, if such a return could ever be made. In the last few sentences, she tries to sort of provide a succinct précis for what she's tried and, at least in my humble opinion, succeeded in doing with this book. She says, the people, that is, the people having lived under these communist regimes, need to know the particular details, not general theories, and they need to hear individual stories, not generalizations about the masses. They need a better grasp of what motivated their predecessors to see them as real people and not as black and white caricatures, victims, or villains. Only then is it possible, slowly, to rebuild. So, if you're interested in the years immediately following World War II and how communism spread, how the ideology was put into place, and how millions of people both managed to become brainwashed, but also, like I said, through some magic of wonderful human resilience, also managed to fight back. It's a really harrowing story, and quite a book. It's 450 pages. It's not too much of an ask, but it is superb history. This is the Iron Curtain, the crushing of Eastern Europe, 1944 to 1956, by the wonderfully talented Anne Applebaum. I will see you guys next week. I hope you enjoyed the review.